The air in the basement of St. Jude's Rural Infirmary didn't just smell like bleach and industrial detergent, it smelled like the end of things. It was 1975, and the hospital felt like a dying animal, its stone walls cold and damp, its upper floors a labyrinth of decaying corridors and forgotten rooms. I was 19, and the only job I could find was here, in the sub-basement, operating the laundry chutes. It was a brutal, sweltering purgatory of iron and steam that felt 1,000 miles away from the life I had known. The system was a marvel of archaic engineering. Massive steel chutes, wide enough to fit a grown man, descended from every floor, ending in the cavernous, iron-lined room I called my kingdom. My shift began at midnight, when the hospital was supposedly quiet. That was when the nurses in the upper wards would start clearing the beds, sending the night's misery down to me. The hospital was a place of long-term care and geriatric trauma, a repository for the old and the broken who had nowhere else to go. Asterisk clang. Thud. Rattle, asterisk. The sound was constant. The sheets would hit the heavy iron mouth of the chute with a wet, heavy thwack. I spent my hours hauling these damp, blood-stained bundles into the towering, roaring steam presses. The machines were beasts, cylinders of heated steel that groaned and shrieked as they churned. The noise was so loud it rattled my teeth, a rhythmic, mechanical pulse that drowned out my own thoughts and kept the crushing loneliness of the basement at bay. The heat was the worst part. It rose from the floor drains, thick and choking, clinging to my skin until I felt like I was being boiled alive. My uniform was permanently stained with a mixture of sweat, soap, and the chemical sharp edge of hospital disinfectants. But the solitude was what truly gnawed at me. I was alone with the history of every patient who had passed away in that hospital. I touched their sheets, I scrubbed their stains, and I felt the lingering, heavy dread of their final hours soaked into the cotton fibers. It was as if the fabric held the imprint of their last, ragged breaths. By 3 a.m., the chute from the third floor, the geriatric and trauma ward, began to deliver something different. A bundle slid out, hitting the floor with a dull, unnatural thud that echoed louder than the machines. It wasn't the usual soft pile of laundry. It was tight, compact, and wrapped with a strange, obsessive precision. I approached it, wiping the sweat from my eyes with a grime-covered rag. The sheet was knotted. Not the casual knot of a busy nurse, but an intricate, professional weave, loops and cinches that looked like shackles. It was heavy, far too heavy for a simple bedsheet. As I reached for it, I heard it. It wasn't the rattle of the pipes or the roar of the boiler. It was a sound from inside the sheet. A faint, muffled, rhythmic sob. It was the sound of someone trying to scream through a mouthful of wet cotton. I froze, my hand hovering over the knot, the steam press behind me roaring like a hungry furnace. The basement felt suddenly, terrifyingly small. The hospital above was supposed to be empty, yet the air in the laundry room felt crowded, packed tight with something that had just come sliding down from the darkness of the upper floors. I reached for my flashlight, the light trembling, and aimed it at the bundle. The fabric was twitching, a slow, sickening movement that defied the physics of a pile of linen. I wasn't just a laundry hand anymore, I was a witness to something that the hospital had tried to bury in the deep, dark belly of its own architecture. I stood there in the steam, realizing that the pipes weren't just transporting sheets, they were transporting the residue of things that should have stayed in the dark. I didn't untie it. I couldn't bring myself to touch that slick, cold knot with my bare hands. Every instinct I had, the primal, animal part of my brain that had kept my ancestors alive in caves, was screaming at me to walk out. But the door upstairs was locked, Miller was likely half-blind on moonshine in his shack, and I was 19 years old with exactly $4 to my name. If I walked away from the machines, I lost the job. If I lost the job, I starved. So instead of running, I grabbed the heavy iron tongs I used for hauling the boiling linens out of the vats and wedged the tips under the edge of the bundle. When I pushed it, the weight felt wrong. It didn't roll like a bundle of cloth should, it slid with a sickening, angular crunch, like a sack of dry firewood shifting against itself. The cotton didn't just bunch up, it stretched tight against a hard, pointed protrusion that looked exactly like a human elbow. But it was too long. The proportions were skewed, distorted by the shadows cast by the single, grease-filmed bulb hanging from the rafters. Asterisk clang. Thud. Rattle, asterisk. The noise didn't stop. The chute from the third floor woke up with a vengeance, its iron throat rattling as if it were trying to clear a blockage. Another bundle hit the concrete with a wet, heavy slap. Then another. Within 3 minutes, the small clearing between the mouth of the pipe and my sorting table was filled with a mountain of white, blood-spotted cloth. And every single one of them was tied with that same, impossible, suffocating shackle knot. The smell in the room changed instantly. The sharp, clean bite of the industrial bleach was overwhelmed by something heavy and wet. It smelled like the stagnant water you find under floorboards after a river floods, a mix of old mud, rotting timber, and scorched fat. The air became so thick with the stench that I had to tie my handkerchief over my nose just to keep from gagging. Miller. I screamed toward the intercom on the wall, my voice cracking and getting swallowed by the rhythmic, deafening roar of the steam presses. Asterisk grind thump hiss. Grind thump hiss, asterisk the machines didn't care about the dark. They just kept turning, their massive iron cylinders glowing with a dull, cherry-red heat that radiated through the entire room. No one answered. The intercom gave nothing but static, a low, rhythmic scratching that sounded less like electrical interference and more like fingernails dragging across a window pane. I looked back at the pile. The central bundle, the first one that had cried, was moving. The knots weren't coming undone, they were tightening. The fabric was twisting in on itself, drawing so tight that the white cotton began to weep a thin, clear fluid that sizzled when it dripped onto the hot concrete. And then, from the middle of the stack, the crying started again. It wasn't a single voice anymore. It was a chorus of muffled, suffocating whimpers, all coming from inside the fabric. It sounded like the geriatric ward during a bad winter, the sound of old lungs struggling for air, of voices that had forgotten how to articulate words, reduced to a collective, rhythmic lamentation. The sound didn't just fill the room, it vibrated through the metal of the tongs in my hand, traveling up my arm until my teeth began to click together. I took 3 steps back, my boots splashing through a puddle of greasy water near the floor drain. The flashlight beam cut through the billowing steam, hitting the open mouth of the chute. The black iron interior wasn't empty. Something was coating the inside of the pipe, a thick, dark grease that was sliding upward against gravity, defying the slope of the steel. The hospital above wasn't just sending down dirty laundry anymore. It was purging. It was clearing out the things that had settled in the walls over 50 years of operations, the heavy, unresolved grief of 1,000 deaths, and it was using the gravity of the chutes to dump the whole mess directly onto my floor. I looked at the wrench on the table, then at the pile of twitching cloth. I was 19, I was alone, and I was realizing that the hardest part of the job wasn't the heat, it was the fact that the dead didn't want to be washed. They wanted to be let out. The basement was no longer just a room, it was a throat, and I was standing at the very bottom of its windpipe. The steam rising from the floor drains didn't dissipate anymore, it hung in thick, yellow blankets that clung to the ceiling like grease, dripping back down in a slow, toxic rain. The heat had crossed the threshold from uncomfortable to violent. It pressed against my eyeballs, making the flickering light of the single bulb smear into long, greasy streaks of orange. I was trapped. The heavy, iron-reinforced oak door that led to the stairs was locked from the outside. That was Miller's rule. To keep the drifters from the woods out of the clean linens, he'd said with a yellow-toothed grin when I took the shift. But standing there, listening to the wet, rhythmic shifting of the pile behind me, I knew the lock wasn't there to keep the outside world out. It was to keep whatever accumulated down here from rising. Whimper. The sound was closer now. It didn't come from the pile of knotted sheets on the floor. It came from the iron chute itself, right at the junction where the third-floor pipe met the main vertical trunk. It was a dry, rattling gasp, like someone trying to breathe through a throat filled with sand. I picked up the heavy brass-headed pipe wrench from my workbench, my palms so slick with sweat and grease that the metal almost slid from my grip. I walked toward the gaping mouth of the chute, my boots making a sticky, sucking sound against the wet concrete. The steam press behind me roared, grind thump hiss asterisk, but the mechanical noise now felt like it was trying to mimic the sound of a massive, iron heart beating inside the stone walls. I raised the flashlight, my hand shaking so violently that the beam danced erratically across the rust-pitted mouth of the pipe. I braced my shoulder against the cold stone wall and angled the light upward, peer deep into the dark of the steel chute. The interior walls of the pipe were shimmering. Under the yellow glare of the flashlight, I could see they were coated in a thick, gray silt that looked like wet ash. But it wasn't static. The silt was crawling. It moved in slow, pulsating ripples, matching the rhythm of the steam presses. And there, suspended about 10 feet up the vertical shaft, was a shape. It was a sheet, but it wasn't falling. It was wedged against the sides of the iron pipe, its fabric stretched so tight it looked like drumhead skin. I could see the outline of what was inside. It wasn't a body, not a whole one, anyway. It was a collection of sharp, disjointed angles that pressed hard against the white cotton. A knee, a sharp collarbone, and a face. The face didn't have eyes or a mouth, it was just a raw pressure pushing against the sheet from the inside, stretching the fibers until I could see the dark void behind it. The nose was flat, pressed hard against the weave, and the jaw was dropped open in a silent, eternal scream. "Get out," I whispered, the words tasting like copper and bleach in my mouth. The thing in the pipe didn't drop. It shifted. The shackle knot at the top of the bundle tightened with a sharp, dry snap that sounded like a dry branch breaking in winter. The fabric didn't slide down the grease-coated iron, it pulled itself. With a sickening, wet scraping sound, the bundle dragged itself 6 inches upward, back toward the third floor, against gravity, against every law of the physical world. As it moved, it left a trail of fresh, dark crimson on the gray silt of the pipe. But it wasn't blood. It was too dark, too thick, smelling of old pine needles and stagnant pond water. It was the residue of a life that had been forgotten, the physical stain of a death that had never been acknowledged by the clean, white wards above. Suddenly, the intercom on the wall buzzed. It wasn't the static this time. It was a voice, high-pitched and frantic, cutting through the roar of the machinery. "Elias? Elias, are you down there?" It was Sister Beatrice, the night nurse from the trauma ward. Her voice was thin, vibrating with a terror that made my own stomach drop. "Sister." I lunged for the wall-mounted box, pressing the heavy brass button with my thumb. "Sister, you need to tell Miller to open the door. There's something in the chutes. It's..." "Elias, listen to me," she interrupted, her voice cracking. "Don't touch the sheets from room 312. Do you hear me? Don't touch them. We made a mistake. We cleared the bed before the doctor signed the ledger. The room is still occupied, Elias. But the bed is empty." The intercom went dead with a loud, metallic pop that smelled of ozone. I turned back to the chute. The bundle that had been pulling itself upward had stopped. It was hovering directly above the opening now, suspended by nothing but the grease on the walls. The face pressed against the sheet turned, the blank, cotton-muffled head tilting down to look directly at me. And then, the knot slipped. The knot didn't just slide loose, it exploded. With a sound like wet canvas tearing under immense tension, the shackle knot holding the bundle suspended inside the chute snapped. The heavy, gray-stained mass plummeted down the vertical iron shaft, hitting the curved lip of the basement intake with a deafening, metallic crash. The impact was so violent it sheared the copper rivets right off the mounting bracket, sending a shower of rusted metal sparking across the wet concrete floor. The bundle rolled. It didn't stop until it wedged itself directly against my boots. I couldn't move. My legs felt like they had been poured full of cold, heavy lead. The heat radiating from the steam presses behind me was suffocating, but the air immediately surrounding the bundle from room 312 was freezing. It was a localized pocket of winter, smelling of dead pine needles, damp earth, and the unmistakable, Swedish rot of gangrene. Asterisk hiss. Hiss. Hiss asterisk. The steam presses were laboring now, their safety valves sputtering as the pressure in the ancient boiler climbed into the red. The yellow fog in the room was growing thicker, refracting the light from the overhead bulb into a dirty, shifting halo. Through the haze, I stared down at the thing resting against my feet. The sheet was soaking wet, but not with water. It was drenched in a thick, translucent fluid that had a faint, greasy shimmer to it, like the trail left by a slug. Underneath the damp layers of white cotton, something was struggling. It wasn't a violent thrashing, it was a slow, agonizingly deliberate expansion. The fabric began to stretch. I watched in paralyzed horror as the outline of a hand, grotesquely elongated, with fingers that seemed to have too many joints, pressed against the inside of the cloth. It slid upward, tracing the seam of the sheet, searching for a way out. Sister Beatrice's words echoed in my head asterisk, the room is still occupied, Elias. But the bed is empty. Asterisk. If the bed in room 312 was empty, then whatever had been lying under these sheets hadn't died. It had become the sheets. It had slipped off the mattress and into the fabric, letting itself be stripped away by the nurses, bundled up, and thrown down the dark, iron throat of the hospital. It had wanted to come down here. To the basement. To me. No, I whispered, finally finding my voice. No, you don't. I lunged backward, my heel catching on the edge of a floor drain. I fell hard, my shoulder slamming against the iron frame of the sorting table. The heavy brass pipe wrench slid from my fingers, clattering into the dark water pooling near the drain. On the floor, the bundle from 312 reacted to the sound. The elongated hand pressed harder against the sheet, the fabric straining until the threads began to pull apart with a series of tiny, high-pitched pops. A tear appeared near the center of the bundle. It didn't reveal skin. It didn't reveal bone. Through the rip in the cloth, I saw a yawning, infinite void of pure, velvet blackness. It was a darkness that seemed to swallow the light from my flashlight, a vacuum that had no bottom. And from that darkness, a smell drifted out that made my stomach turn inside out, the smell of a closet that hadn't been opened in 50 years, filled with damp wool and old, forgotten dust. Thud. Another bundle hit the top of the chute, 3 floors up. The system was still feeding. The nurses on the night shift were still clearing rooms, unaware that the drain at the bottom of the tower was backing up. Elias. The intercom on the wall buzzed again, but the signal was heavily distorted. Sister Beatrice's voice was barely recognizable through the wall of static. It sounded like she was speaking from the bottom of a well. Elias, you have to run the boiler, it's not the steam. The connection cut out, replaced by a high-pitched, drilling whine that made my ears bleed. The speaker horn on the wall began to vibrate so violently that the plaster around the mounting screws started to crumble, raining white dust down into the greasy puddles below. The tear in the sheet from room 312 was widening. The elongated fingers hooked into the edges of the rip, pulling the fabric apart with a wet, heavy groan. The void inside the bundle seemed to ripple, expanding outward like a pool of ink spilled on paper. I scrambled to my feet, my chest heaving as I sucked in the hot, chemical-laden air. The locked oak door was 20 feet away. I knew it was useless, but the instinct to flee was a physical force, screaming in my blood. I bolted toward the stairs, my wet boots sliding on the slick concrete. Behind me, the steam presses shrieked in unison as their main gaskets blew, releasing a blinding wall of white-hot vapor into the room. The basement vanished into the fog, and in the sudden, blinding whiteout, the mechanical heartbeat of the machines finally stopped. There was only the silence. And the sound of wet cotton dragging itself across the floor. The steam pressurized, turning the sub-basement into an opaque tomb. The silence left by the dead presses was worse than the roar. It was a vacuum, punctuated only by the wet, rhythmic dragging of heavy fabric across the concrete. I could hear the damp friction of cloth sliding over stone, a repetitive, scraping motion circling me, moving through the blinding vapor with a sickening, predatory deliberation. I reached the heavy oak door. My blistered palms burned as I slammed my weight against the iron-reinforced wood, rattling the brass latch in a desperate attempt to break free. Miller. I choked out, the air burning my throat. Miller, open the door. The boiler's blown. I'm burning. Only the hollow echo of my voice bounced back. On the other side, there was nothing but the indifferent silence of the hospital. I slid down until my spine pressed against the iron. I raised my hands, staring through the fog at my peeling skin. The pain was a distant, throbbing hum, but the unnatural, biting winter radiating from the center of the room kept my heart hammering against my ribs. Through the chemical-smelling vapor, a silhouette took shape. It didn't move like a human. It was a shifting, geometric mass of white and gray, condensing out of the steam. The sheets, still slick with dark, iridescent fluid from room 312, were folding themselves. They hovered, defying gravity, weaving together with spider-like speed. I watched in paralyzed fascination as shackle knots formed spontaneously along the edges, locking the sheets together into rigid joints. The entity grew. It stood over 7 feet tall, a multi-limbed caricature of a man constructed from St. Jude's discarded linens. Its head was a tangled mass of yellowed bandages and stained cotton, with no eyes or mouth. Yet, as it turned, a sound tore through the quiet. It was static. It radiated directly from the creature's chest. It was a wet, crackling frequency, a radio tune between stations, layered with the faint, distant weeping of dozens. I heard Sister Beatrice's frantic warnings mixed with the rattling coughs of patients long dead, all compressed into an agonizing wave of white noise. The air around me dropped below freezing. My shirt stiffened as frost spiderwebbed across the floor, creeping outward from the creature's base. I scrambled to my feet, my boots slipping on the newly formed ice. I had no weapon, and the air was running out. The superheated steam mixed with the unnatural cold, creating a pressurized atmosphere that felt like breathing wet wool. The creature took a step forward. The sound was a wet, heavy crunch, like boots stomping through frozen mud. A limb of tightly braided sheets reached out, the fibers stretching under immense tension. The pale, elongated fingers I had seen through the tear in room 312's bundle emerged from the sleeve of cloth, reaching toward my face. I didn't think. I dove to the left, my shoulder slamming against the iron frame of the boiler. The cold metal felt like a block of ice, but it was a physical reality I could cling to. I crawled underneath the massive tank, squeezing into the narrow space between the iron cylinder and the freezing floor drains. From my hiding spot, I watched the creature's lower limbs glide past. They left a thick, gray silt on the concrete, an oily residue that smelled of wet earth and old bone. It was searching. The static in its chest flared, the frequency shifting to a high-pitched, drilling whine that made my ears ring. Then, the intercom buzzed. It played a rhythm, a heavy, dual-pulse thud, repeating in a steady cadence like a failing biological pump. It was the heartbeat of the hospital. The mechanical pulse of St. Jude's, driving the rot down into the sub-basement. The creature stopped. Its bandage-wrapped head tilted toward the wall, its body vibrating in perfect synchronization with the sound. It was waiting for the next drop. Above, the iron pipes began to groan. The third-floor chute was clearing its throat, preparing to deliver the rest of room 312. I looked at the drainage valve of the boiler next to my head. If I opened it, the remaining pressure would vent into the room. It would either shred the creature, or cook me alive. I reached out, my blistered fingers wrapping around the iron wheel. I took a breath of the static-charged air, and I pulled. The release of the superheated water inside the core of the boiler was instantaneous. When the heavy iron will gave way, it unleashed a concussive shockwave of scalding moisture that transformed the sub-basement into a complete whiteout environment within seconds. The sudden drop in pressure caused the ancient iron pipes along the ceiling to groan under immense thermal stress, their structural joints warping and protesting as the intense heat expanded the metal. From my position beneath the iron tank, I could see the immediate effect on the entity standing in the center of the room. The pressurized wall of vapor hit the woven linens with the force of an industrial press. The steam tore through the intricate shackle knots, unraveling the tightly braided sheets as if the fabric were nothing more than loose thread. The creature let out a high-pitched, tearing roar, a sound resembling hundreds of old canvas tents being ripped apart by a violent gale, as its form was systematically disassembled by the scalding draft. The pain of the secondary steam blast reached me even under the boiler. The skin on my exposed forearms began to blister, a sharp, searing heat that forced a silent scream from my throat. I clamped my jaw shut, refusing to inhale the boiling fog. The atmosphere became a violent battlefield of elements. The oppressive heat of the mechanical failure fought against the freezing, winter-like air that still emanated from the remnants of the third-floor bundle. Above the roar of the escaping pressure, a structural failure began to propagate through the building's foundation. The ceiling beneath the main vertical laundry trunk began to split. I heard the distinct, heavy snapping of stone blocks and the grinding of mortar as a massive web of fractures spread outward from the chute's iron housing. The hospital above was shifting its weight, its architectural bones settling hard against the basement ceiling to seal the breach. The physical connection between my sweltering prison and the wards above was being crushed shut by the sheer mass of the masonry, a heavy, grinding groan of stone meeting stone signaling the structural shifting of the facility. The lack of oxygen and the intensity of the heat finally took their toll. My vision began to narrow, the white fog dissolving into a dull, featureless gray. The throbbing agony in my hand subsided into a strange, numbing chill, and the mechanical vibrations of the room faded into the distance until there was nothing left but a heavy, rhythmic pulsing in my own ears, like a dull tide receding into absolute silence. When consciousness returned, the room had fallen completely quiet. The steam had condensed into a thick, greasy film that coated every surface, dripping from the ruined machinery with a slow, deliberate cadence. The industrial boiler was an empty, ruptured shell, its iron flank split wide open where the seam had ruptured. On the floor, the towering mass of linens had vanished entirely. In its place lay a thick layer of gray ash, smelling strongly of old soil and burnt cotton, covering the wet concrete like a blanket of dirty winter frost. I dragged myself out from the narrow gap, my limbs heavy and unresponsive to my own willpower. The skin on my hands was raw and weeping, the blisters slick with a film of gray soot, but the bones were intact. I crawled slowly across the ruined floor, bypassing the jagged, twisted remnants of the iron chute. The vertical pipe had been completely flattened by the structural collapse above, its dark throat choked solid with crushed stone and heavy, gray mortar. The delivery system was dead. I reached the heavy oak door and leaned the full weight of my shoulder against the wet wood. I struck the iron reinforcement bar with the side of my fist, trying to summon enough breath to call for the night watchman, but my throat was too dry to produce anything more than a raspy whisper. There was no sound from the other side of the timber, just the vast, indifferent silence of a hospital that had successfully purged its worst memories into the dark. I slumped against the base of the door, staring at the gray silt on the floor, knowing that while the pipe was sealed, the air in the basement would never entirely lose the smell of room 312. They found me when the morning shift came down to locate the missing laundry supplies. The iron door was unbolted from the outside, and the sudden influx of clean, crisp morning air felt like a physical shock against my raw skin. Miller was the one who dragged me out, his rough hand surprisingly gentle as he avoided the weeping blisters on my forearms. He didn't ask what happened, and I didn't offer an explanation. The ruptured boiler and the collapsed masonry above the chute spoke for themselves, a tragic, predictable accident in a building that had been neglected for decades. The next 3 weeks were spent in the isolation ward of a county hospital 30 miles away from St. Jude's. The room was clean, smelling intensely of rubbing alcohol and sterile gauze, a sharp contrast to the greasy, chemical fog of the sub-basement. The doctors treated my arms and face with thick, cool salves, wrapping them in layers of white cotton bandages that made me look like the very entity I had fought in the dark. Every morning, a nurse would come in to change the dressings, the slow, deliberate unrolling of the fabric producing a dry, rhythmic friction that made my heart race with a sudden, involuntary panic. During the quiet hours of the afternoon, the silence of the clinic was broken only by the distant hum of the ventilation system. But for me, the silence was never truly empty. Whenever the breeze from the open window caused the white privacy curtains around my bed to rustle, my eyes would lock onto the movement. I watched the way the fabric swayed, looking for the sudden, geometric folds of the shackle knots, or the distinct, elongated impression of fingers pushing against the weave. The rational part of my mind knew it was just the wind, but my skin remembered the localized winter of room 312. Sister Beatrice never came to visit, but a package arrived on the second week, left at the front desk with no return address. Inside was a small, leather-bound ledger from the hospital's administrative archive, its pages yellowed and brittle with age. I opened it with my heavily bandaged fingers, turning to the records for 1975. When I found the entry for room 312, the space for the patient's name was entirely blank, crossed out with 3 heavy, deliberate strokes of black ink. Below it, in a neat, hurried script that I recognized from the intercom log, were the words, "The account is settled, but the inventory remains." I left Ohio as soon as the dressings came off, carrying the ledger and a permanent network of pale, silvery scars across my arms and hands. I took a job at a shipyard on the coast, where the air was thick with the scent of salt and diesel, far away from the inland valleys and the old stone infirmaries. I worked in the open air, under the wide, indifferent sky, convinced that the distance and the constant roar of the ocean would drown out the mechanical heartbeat of St. Jude's. Yet, the transition was never complete. 10 years later, I still couldn't look at a fresh clothesline without a sense of cold anticipation. One evening, after a heavy summer rain had cleared the coastal air, I walked into the communal washroom of my boarding house. The room was empty, filled with the warm, humid scent of laundry detergent and the low, steady vibration of the commercial dryers. On the folding table in the corner sat a large, neatly stacked pile of white bed sheets, fresh from the cycle. I approached the table, my boots making a soft, rhythmic thud against the linoleum. The sheets were warm, radiating a clean, comforting heat that should have put my mind at ease. But as I reached out to touch the top layer, the vibration of the dryers suddenly dropped in frequency, shifting from a steady mechanical hum into a low, dual-pulsed thud that vibrated through the floorboards. The air in the washroom grew rapidly cold, the scent of the detergent vanishing beneath a sudden, heavy odor of damp earth and old, stagnant well water. The top sheet of the pile didn't move, but the fibers near the center began to draw tight, pulling inward with a faint, high-pitched tension that signaled the beginning of an intricate, professional knot. From deep within the plumbing of the wall, behind the iron pipes that fed the washing machines, I heard the distinct, muffled sound of a dry cough, followed by a slow, dragging friction that was moving toward the drain. The hospital hadn't lost my address, it was simply using a different set of pipes to deliver the remainder of the archive. I didn't run. 10 years of carrying the scars had burned the panic out of me, leaving only a cold, exhausting anger. I stood my ground against the linoleum floor as the frost began to dull the polished surface, creeping toward my boots in jagged, crystalline fingers. The dual-pulsed thud from the walls grew heavier, shaking the metal casings of the dryers until the latches vibrated against the frames. The hospital was claiming this room, restructuring the architecture of a coastal boarding house to mimic the deep, forgotten throat of St. Jude's. I reached out and grabbed the top sheet before the shackle knot could lock itself into place. My scarred fingers sank into the warm cotton, but the heat vanished instantly, replaced by a freezing moisture that numbed my palms. The fabric resisted, pulling back toward the center of the pile with a heavy, angular strength that felt like trying to wrest a rope from a drowning man. I dug my heels into the damp floor and yanked upward, tearing the linen clean off the stack. The movement revealed the sheet beneath it. The white surface was already turning gray, stained with a wet, ash-like silt that leaked from a central, jagged tear. Through the opening, the absolute blackness of the void rippled, expanding outward like an oil slick on a calm sea. The stench of the sub-basement hit my face, a violent mixture of industrial bleach, scorched fat, and the old, wet mud of a long-buried trauma. From the dark center of the torn fabric, the pale, multi-jointed fingers began to slide out. They moved with a horrific fluidity, the elongated tips scraping against the edges of the table as they searched for leverage. The static followed them, radiating from the void not as a sound from a speaker, but as a physical vibration that rattled my jawbone and set my ears to ringing with a high-pitched, drilling frequency. I could hear the faint, layered weeping of the geriatric ward, the rattling gasps of the unrecorded dead, all carried on the cold draft that blew from the rip. Instead of backing away, I lunged forward, slamming my weight against the folding table. The heavy wooden structure screeched against the floor as I shoved it directly into the path of the emerging limbs. The edge of the table caught the elongated hand, pinning the fingers against the metal frame of the nearest dryer. A dry, snapping sound echoed through the room, the sound of brittle, cotton-wrapped bones splintering under the sudden pressure, followed by a muffled, tearing roar that vibrated through the floorboards. The creature inside the linen thrashed, its gray, knotted limbs erupting from the lower layers of the stack, twisting together to form the chaotic, geometric trunk I had seen in the fog a decade prior. It was trying to build itself again, using the laundry of strangers to construct its towering, sightless form. I grabbed the heavy iron fire extinguisher from the bracket near the door. The metal canister was freezing in my hands, covered in a sudden layer of condensation. I didn't hesitate, I drove the heavy base of the cylinder down onto the center of the tearing fabric, smashing the iron valve beneath it. The safety seal ruptured with a sudden, concussive release of pressurized dry chemical, unleashing a dense, white cloud that flooded the corner of the room. The chemical draft didn't dissolve the entity like the steam had, but it choked the void. The white powder coated the wet, gray silt, neutralizing the dark fluid and breaking the tension of the shifting weaves. The shackle knots began to slip, the individual threads losing their grip as the chemical dust settled into the fibers. The multi-jointed fingers twitched violently, then began to recede, sliding backward into the rip like a shadow retreating from the light. Above the mechanical vibration of the dryers, the plumbing inside the walls gave a final, violent shudder. A heavy, downward groan traveled through the iron pipes, a sound of immense pressure receding back into the main line, away from the washroom, away from the coast. The unnatural winter broke, the frost on the linoleum melting instantly into shallow, harmless puddles of gray water. When the dust finally settled, the washroom was quiet again, save for the steady, rhythmic hum of the ventilation fan. The pile of sheets lay scattered across the floor, ruined and covered in white chemical residue, but they were static, inanimate cloth once more. I dropped the empty fire extinguisher, my breath coming in ragged, shallow gasps that tasted of salt and dry powder. My hands were shaking, the silvery scars burning with a phantom heat. I looked down at the ruined laundry, then at the iron drain in the center of the floor. The hospital hadn't finished its delivery, and I knew now that it never would. The inventory was vast, and the pipes ran beneath every floor I would ever walk on. I turned toward the door, wrapping my scarred hands into my jacket pockets, ready for the next shift. The morning after the washroom encounter, I packed my single canvas sea bag, left my keys on the counter of the boarding house, and walked down to the pier. I didn't wait for the landlord to ask about the ruined linens or the empty fire extinguisher. I signed on to the crew of a deep-sea salvage tug named the Orion, a heavy-hulled diesel vessel that spent months at a time 300 miles offshore, tearing down the rusted skeletons of abandoned oil rigs and sunken freighters. For 2 years, the salt and the iron kept me safe. On the open water, there is no plumbing that connects back to the land. The bilge water is pumped directly into the vast, devouring belly of the Atlantic, and the only sheets we used were coarse, stained canvas hammocks that had never seen a drop of starch or the clean, sterile touch of a hospital laundry. The air was clean, stripped of any memory of St. Jude's by the constant, violent gales that swept the deck. I thought I had finally found the edge of the archive. Then came the salvage of the Vanderbilt. She was an old passenger steamer that had foundered during a winter storm in the late 50s, sitting 60 fathoms down on a shifting sandbar. Our job was to cut through the upper promenade deck and recover the ship's log and the contents of the purser's safe. The work was slow, dangerous, and carried out in absolute darkness under the crushing weight of the black water. I sat in the dive control shack on the surface, monitoring the air lines and listening to the rhythmic, metallic respiration of the diver below through the radio comms. The diver's breathing was a steady, mechanical cycle, a wet, dual-pulsed inhalation and exhalation that filled the small shack. Asterisk thump thump. Thump thump, asterisk. I froze, my hand hovering over the pressure valves. The frequency was wrong. The sound wasn't the clean rush of oxygen through a modern regulator, it was shifting, dropping in pitch until it perfectly matched the dual-pulsed heartbeat of the St. Jude sub-basement. Elias, the diver's voice came through the copper speaker horn on the wall. It wasn't the voice of the man I had sent over the side. It was thin, high-pitched, and vibrating with a frantic, familiar terror. Elias, the laundry room, they never cleared the linen lockers before she went down. Get out of there, Davis, I shouted into the microphone, my scarred knuckles turning white against the brass casing. Get out now. Surface immediately. The knots, Elias, the voice crackled through a sudden wall of wet static. The frequency shifted, layering with the faint, collective weeping of dozens of old lungs struggling for air in a flooded hull. They're not hemp. They're cotton. They're drawing tight in the dark. The video monitor on the console flared to life, cutting through the murky green static of the deep-sea camera. 60 fathoms below us, inside the rusted, iron carcass of the sunken steamer, the camera beam illuminated the linen locker. The wooden doors had long since rotted away, but the bundles inside hadn't decayed. They sat in neat, geometric stacks, preserved by the freezing depth, their white cotton surfaces shimmering with a thick, iridescent slime that defied the salt water. As I watched, the current from the open hatch didn't scatter the sheets. They began to fold themselves against the pressure of the ocean. The shackle knots formed spontaneously along the edges of the ancient fabric, locking the wet linens into tight, rigid limbs that extended outward from the locker like the legs of a massive, pale spider. The entity didn't care about the weight of the sea, it was using the infinite pressure of the abyss to forge a body that was denser, heavier, and colder than anything that had ever walked the basement of St. Jude's. The diver's air line on the deck began to violently shake. The thick rubber hose didn't just vibrate, it began to pull downward into the sea with an immense, mechanical force, as if something at the bottom of the line were hauling it down by the throat. The winches on the deck groaned under the sudden tension, the iron drums grinding against their mounts as the steel cables strained. I looked at the emergency axe mounted on the bulkhead next to the console. The scars on my arms burned, the silvery tissue throbbing with a phantom heat that told me exactly how close the winter was. The ocean hadn't drowned the hospital, it had merely given it a larger cellar to store the inventory. I grabbed the axe, stepped out onto the rain-slicked deck, and approached the straining air line. The rubber was stretched so tight it was whistling, a high-pitched, drilling whine that matched the static in my ears. I raised the iron blade above my head, staring down into the black, churning water beneath the hull, knowing that if I cut the line, I was leaving a man behind in the dark. But if I didn't, the thing climbing the hose would finally bring the sub-basement to the surface. The hesitation lasted only a fraction of a second, but in that brief window, the black water alongside the hull began to boil with a thick, frothy effervescence. The rubber hose didn't just pull, it twisted, the thick material spiraling under an immense internal torque as if a giant hand were wringing it dry. The high-pitched whistling of the stretched rubber shifted, deepening into a low, wet friction that vibrated through the wooden deck planks beneath my boots. I brought the axe down. The iron blade bit clean through the pressurized line. The severed ends whipped apart with a sharp, concussive report that sprayed a mixture of mineral oil and stale air across my face. The lower half of the hose vanished into the dark sea like a striking serpent, its weight dragging it down into the 60 fathoms void below. The sudden release of tension caused the deck winches to spin freely, their iron gears letting out a prolonged, grinding protest before falling completely silent. The deck of the Orion fell quiet, save for the steady, heavy thrum of the main diesel engines and the rhythmic slapping of the swell against the hull. I stood at the rail, the axe head resting against the wood, staring into the featureless black water. There were no bubbles. There was no sign of Davis, and no sign of the pale, geometric entity that had been ascending the line. The sea had swallowed the connection, burying the archive once more under the weight of the Atlantic. The captain didn't ask many questions when I handed him the axe. In the salvage trade, men disappeared into the dark water for dozens of ordinary, structural reasons: snagged lines, ruptured seals, or sudden shifts in the wreckage. The official log recorded the incident as a catastrophic equipment failure during deep-sea penetration. But when the crew hauled the remaining steel cables back onto the deck, I noticed that the last 3 feet of the braided wire had been tightly, meticulously wrapped in thin, shredded ribbons of white cotton cloth, secured with a series of small, intricate shackle knots that had to be cut away with a torch. I left the Orion at the next port of call, a bleak, wind-scoured harbor on the northern coast of Newfoundland. I knew then that the water was no longer a barrier. The hospital's inventory wasn't bound by geography or the layout of municipal pipes, it was a systemic rot, an unresolved ledger of suffering that used any conduit, whether iron, rubber, or stone, to find the man who had witnessed its birth in the dark. I moved inland, away from the coast, away from the rivers, settling in an arid, high-altitude basin in New Mexico where the air was so dry the skin on my hands began to crack. I took a job at an open-pit copper mine, working the rock crushers where the only moisture came from the occasional dust suppression spray. The environment was entirely mineral, composed of red earth, crushed limestone, and the sharp, metallic tang of pulverized ore. There were no commercial laundries here, no steam presses, and no communal washrooms. For 3 years, the desert dryness kept the winter at bay. The pale scars on my forearms faded into tough, weathered leather under the relentless sun. I began to believe that the sheer lack of humidity had finally starved the entity, that without a wet medium to travel through, the shackle knots would simply dry up and turn to dust. Then, during a late August thunderstorm, the basin experienced a flash flood. The rain didn't fall in drops, it fell in sheets, a violent, blinding downpour that transformed the dry arroyos into raging, mud-choked rivers within 20 minutes. The power grid at the mine failed, plunging the maintenance sheds into a deep, shadow-filled gloom. I was inside the main tool room, trying to secure the heavy iron jacks, when the floor drains began to gurgle. The sound wasn't the ordinary rush of rising stormwater. It was a slow, dual-pulsed thud that echoed from the concrete floor, a heavy, rhythmic heartbeat that set the metal tool racks to vibrating against the corrugated walls. The hot, dusty air of the shed vanished instantly, replaced by a sudden, freezing draft that smelled intensely of old pine needles, stagnant mud, and the sharp, chemical bite of industrial bleach. I looked down at the central drain. The brown, muddy floodwater wasn't rising into the room. Instead, a thick, gray silt was bubbling up from the iron grate, sliding upward against the slope of the concrete. And within that silt, the white fibers were already beginning to spin, weaving together with a frantic, spider-like speed to form the first intricate knot. I did not back away toward the downpour. Stepping into the storm meant entering the entity's domain. The basin had become a fluid network of water, connecting every pipe and drain in the valley. The maintenance shed, with its elevated floor, was the only high ground I had left. I watched gray silt spread across the concrete, refracting the amber glow of the wall lanterns. The white fibers didn't just spin, they harvested the environment. From the tool room, rags and discarded cotton waste slid toward the drain, drawn by localized gravity. They adhered to the central mass, their petroleum-soaked threads weaving into the pale linen core rising from the iron grate. The cold became a physical weight, pressing against my chest until my breath came in frosty plumes. The dusty smell of copper ore was replaced by the stench of stagnant hospital wards, damp plaster, and the rot of decaying tissue. A sound vibrated through the steel walls. Not thunder, but a high-pitched, discordant hum that resonated in my skull. It felt like the static of a dead frequency, layered with a chorus of rattling coughs and desperate breathing. The frequency shifted, rising until the glass cabinets began to chatter. From the shifting fabric, a limb emerged. Thicker than those I'd fought before, reinforced by industrial rags. The joint was secured by an enormous shackle knot as hard as cured oak. The pale, multi-jointed fingers did not search blindly, they reached for the workbench, leaving deep, frost-bitten scratches in the thick top. I grabbed a 5-foot pry bar. The metal threatened to tear skin from my palms, but adrenaline overrode the sting. I lunged, driving the bar into the center of the rising knot. The impact was deadened, as if striking dense wet clay. The bar sunk deep into the compacted linen, but the entity did not flinch. Instead, the fibers constricted, wrapping tightly around the iron shaft with a friction that pulled the weapon from my grasp. I felt the mechanical strength, a force born of decades of accumulated weight, of countless bodies lowered into the dark. The head formed, a featureless dome of bandages that tilted toward me. The static in my ears rose to a drilling whine, accompanied by a rapid, dual-pulsed thudding from the floorboards that matched my own pulse. I scrambled backward, boots slipping on the ice. My back hit the generator casing. To my left were the copper cables that ran to the main rock crusher. They carried the residual charge of the backup grid, humming with dangerous warmth. If the entity was made of linen and mineral-heavy silt, it was a conductor. I grabbed the insulated handles of the emergency disconnect switch. My hands, mapped with St. Jude scars, did not shake. I waited as the towering mass dragged itself out of the drain, blocking the exit. It raised knotted arms, freezing air radiating from its chest in waves of blue frost. When the creature took its final step, its wet base bridging the gap between the drain and the copper grounding wire, I threw the switch. The discharge was blinding. A brilliant arc of electricity leapt from the terminal box, striking the gray shoulder with a snap that shook the structure. The smell of burning ozone filled the room, clashing with the stench of decay. The entity stiffened, illuminating from within as current surged through the salt-laden fibers. The static dissolved into a shriek of tearing fabric as fire cooked the water inside the linen. The knots charred, joints blackening and bursting under thermal expansion. The creature collapsed, disintegrating into a pile of smoking, electrified rags. The current grounded into the drain in rhythmic sparks that cast dancing shadows across the ceiling. I stood by the generator, watching smoke rise from the remains. The heat of the electrical fire pushed the winter out, melting ice into steaming puddles. The thudding in the walls slowed, weakening until it was nothing more than the rumble of the thunderstorm passing over the mountains. The basin had not saved me, but it had given me the power to burn the connection. I let go of the switch, looking at my scarred hands. The ledger was still open, but for tonight, the inventory was reduced to ash. The cleanup took until dawn. By the time the storm cleared and the first amber rays of the desert sun cut through the corrugated metal doors, the pile of industrial rags had reduced to a dry, friable soot. I swept the remains directly into the iron drain, watching the gray dust wash away with the final remnants of the recovering floodwater. The mine manager assumed the charred generator box and the shattered glass were the results of a direct lightning strike on the warehouse roof, a routine hazard of the southwestern monsoon season. I let him think that. I quit the mining operation before noon, drawing my remaining pay in cash. The realization had settled deep into the marrow of my bones as I watched the electric arc tear through the linen entity. It didn't matter how far I ran, how dry the air was, or how deep the ocean became. The entity wasn't a physical creature hunting me across the continent, it was a structural necessity of the world I lived in. St. Jude's was merely the point of origin, the place where the ledger had been kept, but the archive itself was built into the very fabric of human infrastructure. Wherever there were pipes to carry wastewater, sheets to cover the sick, and linen to bury the dead, the inventory would continue to accumulate. I bought a rusted, 20-year-old pickup truck with a mechanical carburetor and no modern electrical systems. I drove north, bypassing the major highway networks, staying on the gravel access roads that cut through the high sagebrush plains of Wyoming and Montana. I didn't stay in motels, and I didn't use public laundries. I slept in the bed of the truck under a stiff, oil-treated canvas tarp that repelled the mountain dew, washing my single change of clothes in the cold, fast-moving currents of subalpine creeks using raw lye soap. 6 months passed in absolute isolation. My world became small, silent, and entirely defined by the hard, dry realities of stone and wood. The pale, silvery scars on my arms remained, but they no longer throbbed with the phantom warmth that warned of the creature's approach. The winter had gone quiet. In late October, the first heavy snow of the season caught me in the high country near the Canadian border. The pickup's engine died 3 miles outside a small, dying timber settlement called Blackwood, a collection of weathered gray cabins clustered around a defunct sawmill. The air was crisp, tasting of frost and dry pine needles, a clean winter that carried none of the foul, damp rot of the Ohio valleys. I checked into the town's only boarding house, a 2-story log structure run by a retired rail worker whose joints had stiffened with the climate. My room was small, heated by a small wood-burning stove in the corner that kept the air dry and aromatic with the scent of split tamarack. The bed was covered in a heavy, hand-woven wool blanket that had never seen an industrial press. For the first time in years, I let my guard down, letting the dry heat of the stove lull me into a deep, dreamless sleep. I woke in the middle of the night to a change in the room's atmosphere. The fire in the stove had gone out, leaving only a bed of cold, gray ash behind the iron door. The temperature in the small cabin had plummeted far below the natural chill of the mountain night. My breath came in thick, white plumes that hung stationary in the absolute stillness of the room. The scent of pine and split wood was gone, replaced by the heavy, suffocating odor of damp earth, old dust, and the sharp, chemical bite of carbolic acid. From the walls of the log cabin, a sound began to manifest. It wasn't the wind through the eaves or the groaning of the timber under the weight of the snow. It was a low, rhythmic vibration that pulsed through the floorboards, a dual-pulsed thud that repeated with a slow, mechanical precision. Asterisk thump thump. Thump thump, asterisk. I sat up, my hand instinctively reaching for the heavy iron fire poker beside the stove. The room was dark, the only illumination coming from the pale moonlight reflecting off the snow outside the window. In that dim, blue light, I looked at the washstand in the corner. There were no pipes in this cabin, the water was carried in from a well outside in a heavy zinc pitcher that sat on a wooden shelf. There was no conduit for the entity to travel through. Yet, as I watched, the dry wool blanket covering my legs began to stiffen. The coarse, gray fibers didn't fold with the natural suppleness of fabric, they began to draw tight, pulling inward along the edges with a sharp, high-pitched tension that set the threads to groaning. A series of small, intricate shackle knots began to form spontaneously along the hem, locking the heavy wool into rigid, geometric angles. The hospital hadn't used the plumbing to find me this time. It didn't need a pipe. The ledger had simply reached its final page, and the room itself was beginning to fold. I slid out from beneath the stiffening wool before the hem could lock around my ankles. The moment my bare feet hit the pine floorboards, the cold bit into my skin like a rows of needles. The wood wasn't just cold, it was wet. A thin, greasy film of moisture was weeping upward from the grain of the timber, turning the dry knots of the logs into smooth, dark eyes that reflected the moonlight. The heavy wool blanket didn't fall to the floor. It stood upright on the mattress, its mass shifting as the hand-woven threads were forcibly reordered by the geometry of the sub-basement. The gray wool began to interlace with the pale cotton of the sheets beneath it, forming a thick, mottled trunk that extended toward the low rafters. The sound grew louder, no longer confined to the floorboards. The dual-pulsed thudding resonated within the log walls themselves, a heavy, mechanical heartbeat that seemed to draw the very dimensions of the cabin inward. The logs were groaning, their structural seams splitting as the mortar between them dried up and turned to dust, falling in a pale, silent curtain around the perimeter of the room. There was no drain in the floor, no iron chute in the corner. But the entity didn't need one anymore. It was pulling the room into itself. The white privacy curtain on the iron rod by the washstand ripped free of its rings, flying through the dark air to drape over the rising mass like a shroud. From the center of the shifting gray and white linens, the static broke through the quiet. It was a dry, paper-thin rustle at first, which quickly deepened into the wet, crackling frequency of a radio trapped between stations. Through the white noise, I heard the faint, overlapping voices of the Blackwood sawmill workers mixed with the long-dead patients of St. Jude's, all condensed into a single, collective sigh for air. The bulbous, bandage-wrapped head emerged from the top of the linen pillar, tilting downward until the featureless face was level with mine. The air around it was so intensely cold that the moisture from my breath froze instantly into tiny, glittering crystals that fell like dust between us. I gripped the iron fire poker, its handle freezing against my scarred palms. I didn't strike. The steel bar had been twisted out of my hands in the desert, the iron axe had only bought me a few years on the sea. The physical world was running out of tools to fight a ledger that refused to close. The creature raised a multi-jointed arm, the heavy wool and stained cotton fibers groaning under a tremendous internal tension. The pale, elongated fingers emerged from the frayed cuff of the privacy curtain, reaching through the blue moonlight toward my chest. They didn't move with the sudden violence of a predator, They moved with the slow, administrative certainty of a clerk reclaiming an item long overdue. I backed toward the small window, my shoulder blades hitting the frozen glass. The pain vibrated against my spine, the rhythm matching the heavy thudding in my ears. Outside, the snow-covered settlement of Blackwood was completely silent, its dark cabins buried under the drifts, oblivious to the fact that the geography of the Ohio Valley had overwritten this corner of the mountain. The creature's hand stopped 3 inches from my throat. The static in its chest suddenly shifted, dropping in pitch until the layered voices fell away, leaving only a single, dry whisper that echoed from the center of the linens. It didn't speak my name. It spoke the number of the room. The tension in the air reached a breaking point. The glass behind me shattered outward, the fragments falling silently into the deep snow below. The cold wind from the pass rushed into the room, but it didn't break the localized winter of the entity. The gray silt began to pour from the tears in the blanket, covering the floorboards like an oily tide, erasing the last remaining boundaries between the cabin and the sub-basement. I raised the poker one last time, looking straight into the featureless cotton dome, ready to let the inventory claim its final entry. The iron poker slipped from my fingers, clattering against the ice-slicked floorboards with a dull, hollow, and final echo. My hands, mapped with the silvery, twisted, and weeping tissue of old, necrotic burns, hung loose at my sides as if they no longer belonged to me. For 14 agonizing years, I had run across oceans, burning deserts, and frozen mountain ranges, carrying the physical and psychological scars of a horrific debt I had never asked to inherit. But as the gray, oily silt rose over my ankles like a rising tide of bile, I understood with a shuddering, claustrophobic dread that you cannot outrun an archive that is built into the rotting foundation of the world. The entity did not strike with violence, it caressed. The elongated, cotton-wrapped fingers, stiff with dried blood and ancient dust, simply rested against my collarbone, their touch carrying the absolute, soul-shattering, bone-deep chill of a sub-basement that had never seen the warmth of the sun. The static in its chest began to slow, the wet, chaotic, and screeching frequencies of 100 dead, tortured voices resolving into a single, rhythmic, and heavy vibration that matched the slow, agonizing thudding in the walls. Asterisk thump thump. Thump thump, asterisk. It sounded like a dying heart being crushed under the weight of an iron boot. The cabin around us was completely erased. The log walls had dissolved into the white-hot, opaque, and scalding fog of the St. Jude sub-basement, the scent of fresh cedar replaced entirely by the suffocating, chemical stench of scorched, rotting laundry and wet, moldering mortar. The broken window had vanished, replaced by the heavy, iron-reinforced oak door, bolted from the outside, trapping me once more in the suffocating, airless tomb where the boiler had ruptured and boiled the life from the air. The creature's multi-jointed, hideous limbs began to unravel, the heavy wool and gray, putrid linens loosening their tight, geometric, and clicking joints. But they did not fall to the floor. Instead, the frayed, razor-sharp edges of the fabric began to weave outward like a swarm of hungry worms, wrapping around my forearms, my chest, and crushing my throat. The shackle knots formed spontaneously against my trembling skin, drawing tight with a sadistic, administrative pressure that felt less like a restraint and more like a final, proper, and tight-fitting funeral shroud. I did not fight the crushing, strangling weave. As the damp, infected cotton pressed against my raw, exposed scars, the phantom heat that had burned inside them for a decade finally subsided, replaced by a deep, numbing, and terrifying quiet that signaled the end of my existence. The agony of the old burns, the bone-deep exhaustion of the long, hopeless flights, and the heavy, crushing weight of the ledger in my pocket all faded into the merciless, absolute cold of the void. My vision began to narrow, the yellow, acidic fog of the steam presses closing in around the edges of my sight like a tightening noose. The frantic, mechanical, and distorted heartbeat of the hospital slowed, dropping in frequency until the intervals between the pulses grew wider, drifting toward an absolute, cold, and motionless silence that promised nothing but eternal erasure. Above us, deep within the crumbling walls, the rusted iron pipes gave one final, distant, and tortured groan as the structural fractures settled, sealing my fate within the masonry. The inventory was finally complete. The empty space in the ledger for room 312 didn't need to be crossed out anymore, it had been filled with my own scream. I took one last, trembling breath of the freezing, static-charged air, closed my eyes as the frost crystallized on my eyelids, and let the cold, suffocating linens fold me into the dark forever.